Hello and welcome. We're here at Holistic Investments, and I'm your host, Konstantin Kogan. And I'm excited to have an amazing guest today, Alex Tapscott, who is an author of Web3, Charting the Internet Next Economic and Cultural Frontier. He's also Managing Director, Portfolio Manager at 9 Point Partners. He was a co-founder and still is a co-founder of Blockchain Research Institute. Really excited to have you here, Alex. Hi.
Well, thanks for having me.
We're going to talk a lot about exciting things today about your journey. Like, how did you find blockchain? How did you end up writing an awesome work? But before that, traditionally, I want to throw a legal disclaimer so that this content is for informational purposes only. You should not construe any such information or other material as legal, tax, investment, financial, or any other advice. I know you would appreciate it since your firm, 9 Point, as I remember, they're the largest independent asset management firm in Canada, right? And you're also an independent advisor, right?
9 Point is a large investment company in Canada. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
But
So can you maybe really briefly tell us about your story? How did you end up in Web3 world, and what made you excited about it?
well, I got into Web3 before Web3 entered the vernacular. The only word that we were using then was called Bitcoin, and that was 2014. And I think like a lot of people, when I first learned about Bitcoin, I was skeptical but pretty curious. At the time, I was working in investment banking, but specifically, I was working in a capital markets role. So on a trading desk where I was covering, large asset managers, trading in a variety of different assets, primarily cash equities, so like stocks. And like anybody in that industry, always curious about new assets, new ways to make money, new things that people were talking about. And so I remember a conversation quite vividly, actually. I was on the trading desk and my head trader told me, have you heard of this thing called Bitcoin? And I hadn't. And by then, this was, Bitcoin had been around for a while. Like I was slightly late to the game. This was 2000, maybe 2013 when I first heard about it. But it was really 2014 that I started to, pay a lot of attention. And at first, I was convinced that this was a new asset that could, potentially be a moneymaker, an investment. I was seeing how it was being used and this passionate community around it. But the more I dug in, the more I began to realize that it was more than just some new asset or even asset class, that this was a new technology platform for value, and that it was going to have a huge, potentially a huge impact on the industry that I was working in at the time. When I worked in the business, and I think it's probably still true today, we used paper certificates to record trades that used to get pushed down into this thing called the cage, where all these orders were processed by human beings. And the front end of finance was always very automated. You press a button, you buy a stock or whatever. But the back end, I thought, was always quite antiquated. So the idea to me of a ledger that everyone can see and trust, but no one can alter, that can serve as a single source of truth and eliminate all of that complexity seemed like really compelling to me. But the more, so I started to look into Bitcoin and later blockchain. And that was mostly in collaboration actually with my dad, Don Tapscott, who's a business author who's written about the impact of many technologies over the years on business, on finance, government, society, and so forth. And together we started to do some research on this. I was still working at the time full time, but I was taking, a little bit of time on weekends and evenings to pursue this passion. And we began to sort of come to this conclusion that not only was this a new asset, and not only was it a new medium for value, but it was maybe a new platform for the web. That for 30, 40 years, we've had an internet of information. It's changed how we move and share information, how we access it. It's turned people into publishers. It's democratized information and upended lots of industries like media, publishing. And I think that's all really interesting. But we've never had a way to move and store value peer to peer. And so blockchains to us looked like a new sort of layer or a new era of the web, an internet of value. And, when it comes to assets, the opportunity is much, much greater than it was for information, because assets and money are the lifeblood of our economy, and finance is the cardiovascular system. So to me, the opportunity, the thing that it was poised to disrupt just seemed much much greater. So by then I was fully like down the rabbit hole, very hooked, convinced that this was going to be a big deal. And I was given an offer I couldn't refuse, which is that my dad and I together wrote a proposal for a new book that would try and explain all of this stuff to a mainstream audience. And to my surprise, but not to his, we received a terrific offer from Penguin Random House, who told us, we love this book idea and we love this father-son duo routine that you've got. So why not give it a shot? So that was 2016 or 2015. The book came out in 2016, and they say luck is the combination of preparation and good timing. Well, we felt like we'd prepared. We'd put a lot of effort and energy into this new book, and we also benefited from great timing. 2016 was, I think, a period when the first real wave of people was trying to understand this technology, and there was no book out there for them to read that they could just pick up and understand it. And so we were the first in the market, and I think we wrote a pretty good book. And as a result, Blockchain Revolution has sold over 500,000 copies and has been translated into 19 languages. And it's really propelled me into a full-time career in this industry where I've done lots of different things. I was an early advisor to a couple of blockchain projects, including one of the top layer one projects in the world. I was also I was also a venture capital investor, raised $20 million and invested it into early stage projects, pre sort of token stage opportunities. We raised 20 million and returned about 50 million to investors over a 2.5 year time frame. And I've also done a lot of research and writing in the space. I've co-founded the Blockchain Research Institute, which counts, as members, past and present, companies like Coca-Cola and Exxon and Accenture and Microsoft and CIBC and Manulife Securities. So, blue chip sort of Fortune 100 companies who all are trying to understand what the impact of blockchain and Web3 is going to be on their world. And then, yes, more recently, I've taken on a role as the head of the digital asset group at 9 Point Partners, where I'm in a way kind of melding my interest in traditional finance with my interest in the frontier of finance, and that's been a really rewarding experience too. So that's sort of me in a nutshell. And then, of course, the big thing is that 2 years ago, I started working on a new book called Web3: Charting the Internet's Next Economic and Cultural Frontier. I felt the time was right for a new book. They say the future is bright, but it's not always clear. And in my mind, there was a lot of mud on the windshield. I think there's a lot of common misconceptions and misinformation in this world that really clutters people's perspective. And the time I felt was right for a reset, for some book to help reset the conversation and explain, with what I hope are ideas and themes, that can stand the test of time. Not, who's up, who's down, token prices, whatever. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in giving people a field guide for the internet's next economic and cultural frontier. So I hope I've done that with the new book.
I'm sure you did, because I actually bought it. Like, it's here, so and we're going to talk about it in depth. But before we jump into your book, and I want to just pick your brain a little bit about what you've just mentioned, right? So you had a tremendous career, successful career. I mean, but by the way, Blockchain Revolution, it was one of my first books that I've read in blockchain, right? Because as you mentioned, there are not many options back then, right? And obviously, kudos to you and your dad, and I think it was an amazing work, and it was an important one. I should say that. Now, I love the way you frame the narrative, right? That you always talk about the big ideas, what can be at the end, because it's so easy to be dissuaded, by the, the pump and dump games, the other, negative events, which unfortunately, our industry is very cyclical, right? And it happens that you have a lot of negative news. Now, you also mentioned that you raised $20 million fund, and now you're working with one of the top Canadian, institutional investors, so to speak, right? And you have, if I'm not mistaken, 7 billion under management, right? And manage alternative assets, not only crypto, but other alternative assets, right? And can you talk a little bit about how your investment thesis changed over time? Let's say things since 2016 to 2000, let's say 13, really briefly, how do you view the market right now? What happened back then and how we matured now?
Certainly. So, when we first started out writing the book, Blockchain Revolution, the market was pretty small. Bitcoin was the biggest by far, and the whole market capitalization of tokens was maybe $12 billion. So if the entire market had been a publicly traded company,
Mhm.
it would have been, barely cracked the S&P 500, right? Like I think that Under Armour or the Gap or something, they're at the bottom of the S&P 500 and they're about a 10 billion market cap. So, today the market value for that asset class alone is over $1.25 trillion and encompasses a lot more than Bitcoin. That's for sure. Though Bitcoin continues to play a very important role in the industry. I haven't been working as an investor for the entire period since 2016, so I can't say that it's evolved year to year. But I will say that in those very early days, like in 2017, when we were deploying capital, it was mostly about layer ones, even back then, which is so interesting because everyone thinks of like the alternative layer one thesis as being part of the story for 2021. We saw Ethereum in a way almost a victim of its own success. Gas fees were increasing. The network was seeing a lot of congestion. And so we needed some other platforms to share the load pretty much and to maybe do things differently and maybe better, right? That was the whole thesis. But that was also the thesis back then, too. Now, the irony, of course, is that during that period of time, a lot of those layer one platforms, like some of the ones that launched, and they didn't call themselves that, but they called themselves sort of general purpose blockchains, began as ERC20 tokens before moving to their own networks, which is really funny, right? It's like we're going to be this thing that kills Ethereum, but we're actually going to launch on Ethereum first and then migrate over to our own chain. So I think that's a reflection of how early we were. But even back then, there were some interesting signs of a lot of the applications that have become much more popular now. In the book, Blockchain Revolution, the first book, we talked about how blockchain was going to transform financial services, what it was going to mean for art and for culture. We talked about a thing called crypto collectibles, which
Mhm.
eventually became NFTs. We talked about reimagining financial services. We have this interesting, I think, mental model that includes all the functions of finance, moving value, storing value, accessing credit, how we trade, how we connect investors with startups, how we do accounting, how we organize financial information. Like the idea was, could we, instead of just changing the interface for finance, fintech. That's what I think of fintech is, sort of digital wallpaper. Could we reimagine finance from the ground up? And then, of course, a couple of years later, that's what happened with DeFi. And there's, DeFi has got growing pains, but that's fundamentally what it does. It tries to reimagine finance from the ground up. So all of these things were kind of percolating back then. Nowadays the market is much more mature, and I'm not a full-time investor in the world of tokens anymore. I have investments with friends who are venture capitalists, and so I have my hobby horses, but in general, I let them take care of that on my behalf.
Yeah, and that's well understood. And I think now we can talk about like with a natural transition and your evolution of your vision, right? So in the new book, basically Web3, you're talking about like you actually break it down into three parts, right? Disruption, transformation, leadership. So I want to ask you something more unconventional before we jump into it. Like, why did you pick this particular structure?
Say that one more time. So the structure.
So that you break down the book into three parts, right?
Yeah.
Disruption,
Yeah.
transformation, leadership, right? So
Yeah.
I'm curious, what was the idea behind it to break it down like this into this structure?
Well, the easy answer is every book needs a structure. So I needed to have some structure.
Correct.
So that's number one. Number two is, the book is broken down, as you say, into these three sections. Section number one is meant to introduce the big idea and then to give people, to level set everybody's information, right? So there's lots of, I think, like my hope with a book like this is that it will be read by Web3's pioneers, that people who are doing this stuff will find this book useful. But it's also meant for everybody else. It's meant for, enterprise leaders, managers, government officials, journalists, students, anybody really who cares about the future and maybe wants to play a role in shaping it or wants to understand how they can get involved, right? So that's a big audience, and that's intentional. I'm trying to reach a big audience. So with that in mind, we've got to make sure that everyone's working on the same set of facts. And so that's sort of chapter 2. And then it goes into what you say are the transformations. So the book is organized in what I would view are sort of like concentric circles, starting with the most elemental and then building out from there. And the most elemental thing, the most basic transformation is to assets, right? So blockchains at their core are a digital medium for value. They enable us to program scarcity into the web and to allow people and businesses and other entities to move and store and organize assets peer to peer. And that's like the key core sort of like kernel. Now, blockchains are one of many technologies which are converging around Web3, and that also includes technologies like artificial intelligence and extended reality. But at its core, none of Web3 is possible without this concept of a token or a digital asset, right? So we have to start there. And then from there, I look at what the impact is going to be on people. So what does it mean to be an internet user? How does it impact creators? What does it mean to be a citizen, in a way, or to be connected into the global digital economy as a human being? So we look at the human side of it. Then I look at the impact on organizations. And so, what is the way in which this technology will, I guess, further decentralize companies or make them more digitally native? How can we use this toolkit to create new kinds of organizations that weren't possible before? And that conversation is a lot about distributed autonomous organizations and other forms of like internet native problem solving. And so the thesis there is simply that, the Silicon Valley is known for a long time that if you want to attract the best people, you've got to cut them in on the equity. And so ownership, we know, is a huge incentive for people to do something with their time. And the idea of a DAO and of Web3 is simply that you can turn not just employees, but all of the users and contributors to your service or application, you can turn them into owners. And owners care more. Now, this is something that's only really possible with a DAO. If you wanted to launch a new software company and start with a corporation as your framework, and you wanted to offer ownership using some mechanism to people who were using your service in 50 different countries, how would you do it? Literally, how would you do it? You'd have to have lawyers in every country. You'd have to have options agreements or RSU agreements or something. You would have to translate contracts into 20 languages in order to make them enforceable. You'd have to do all of this stuff. It just would never be feasible to onboard a user, right? Because like the acquisition cost for a user is like $50 or something. Why would you spend all this money? Now with tokens and with DAOs, you can do it much more simply. You can give people a way to earn passively a token reward for being a user of a platform. Now, why would you do that? I think in Web3, a lot of people look at this as like, oh, this is a way to make a quick buck and then move on to the next thing. The idea in practice should be if you're contributing value to something and you're a long-term user, that you should be rewarded with ownership, right? It's like if you're going to create value for something, you might as well own it. And that's true for every single kind of software, most software applications, most kinds of organizations. A decentralized exchange is only as useful as its liquidity. If you can't trade the assets, then it's not very useful. A social application is only as useful as the number of people who are using it. You need that social graph, that critical mass of people in order to make it any fun, right? An online game, like a massive multiplayer game, is only fun if other people are in that environment as well. So there's all these reasons why users actually add value to these platforms. And we should be able to compensate them for that. So I think that that's just a new paradigm, basically, that has been applied successfully to some kinds of projects, like in the DeFi space, but can be more widely applied to other organizations. In the book, I talk about the theory of the firm. Now, this is, I don't want to get too like academic here, but basically there's this important theory of why companies exist. And it was pioneered by a famous economist named Ronald Coase. And he asked the question, he said, why do we even have companies to begin with? Like, well, why isn't everyone just a contractor, negotiating and bidding in an open market? He said, the reason is transaction costs. So long as it's cheaper to do things inside the boundaries of a firm, then in an open market, companies will continue to grow. So he was someone who was writing in the 1920s, and he was looking at the average company, not the average company, like the archetypal company, the Ford Motor Company. And he's saying, look, they don't just make cars. They've got a timber mill, they have a rubber plantation, they have steel works, they've got coal, they've got all this stuff. And they're not interested in, bidding in an open market. They're just putting everything inside of the firm. Now, technology tools for the last 100 years have lowered transaction costs so that it's easier to outsource and offshore and to find partners and collaborators to build a business. So today, like Apple, which is the closest thing we have to the Ford Motor Company of today, has 150 subcontractors in China alone. The Apple doesn't have a steelworks for its phones. It knows that it can outsource these things, right? So that's where technology has gotten us today. And my opinion is that this new toolkit helps to extend a process that's been going on now for many years, which is to disaggregate the firm further, to make it more global and more digitally native. And that's something that is only possible with tokens. Okay, so that's organizations. I'll speed up. And then we look at industries, so different kinds of industry transformations, financial services, gaming, physical infrastructure, and so forth. Then I try to take a look at the metaverse. And try and reconcile these two different points of view, which is that most of the conversation around the metaverse today is about virtual reality being pioneered by huge companies like Facebook and Apple. And then there's another side, which is talking about, tokens and digital ownership. And I'm trying to figure out, like, what is the actual metaverse here? Because if the metaverse is just virtual environments that are controlled and owned by big companies, that's not a new shared reality. That's just virtual Disneyland, right? That's like a diversion. It's entertainment. It's not something new and profound. And Disneyland is okay, but people shouldn't confuse, being in a virtual Facebook environment with being on some new plane of human existence. So I think in order to fulfill that, we need to have all the same kinds of rights, property rights, rights to privacy, and so forth, which are only possible with Web3. And then I look at civilization. So what does this mean for global governments? How's it going to impact social issues and so forth? And then the final section is on challenges, what could go wrong and why this might not work. And then, of course, a conclusion, giving some recommendations, honestly, to readers in terms of what they can do next. So I hope I've given away enough of the book that people want to buy it, but not too much that they're like, well, I already know the gist, so I don't need to pick it up. There's it's 300 pages long, so there's a lot more detail in there. And I encourage you all to check it out.
There's definitely enough like historical context and know-how, like and beautifully placed, like all this content together to read it, and that's what I highly recommend. But I want to go to a few concepts that you basically attack in the beginning, right? So you talk about the concept of third era, right? There are many attempts, like one of my friends, Matthew Lamerrill, he introduced a book like a fifth era, right? So his concept is like to divide it into five like major evolutionary chapters, starting from agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, and then now we have like more like technological revolution, right? In your case, you approach it a little bit differently, right? In the first part, disruptions, right? So can you talk a little bit about like what do you call the third era, right? And what does it mean conceptually for us, or like Web3?
Sure. Well, for starters, I will say that, I think there's a right now people think of Web3 and crypto as being sort of interrelated or being the same thing. And they're not the same thing. They're interrelated, but they're not the same thing. Right now, there are several technologies all emerging at once. Or at least several technologies that are really hitting their stride. Most of them are overnight success stories, many decades in the making. But we're right now seeing this experience where they're all hitting an inflection point. Blockchains, which we've discussed. AI, which is reimagining what we thought computers could do, and I think will completely reshape our world. Extended reality. For decades, we've had a two-dimensional internet experience, and now we're on the precipice of a spatial web. A web that is three-dimensional and integrated into our world. And then connected devices. In the not too distant future, there will be billions and trillions of connected devices, but they will not only be connected to the web, they'll be autonomous. They'll have intelligence because of AI, and they'll have the ability to transact because of blockchains. So my point is that these are not separate, but related. And I think in the same way that the term internet went from describing a very narrow set of sort of internetworking technologies to describing everything, a whole range of technologies, new business models, new social behaviors, and other phenomena. I think the term Web3 is going to help to define the next era of the web, and that all of these technologies are going to play some role in that, right? So that's sort of the starting point. But more specifically, Web3 is the ownership web. So I'll start just going back. So Web 1 was basically a medium for the presentation of static information on websites, pretty much, right? So, Constantine, you look like someone who's probably old enough to use the web in the 90s. I can't totally tell. I was. And
Yes.
I and yeah, you may recall it was not a very fun well, it was fun, but it was not a very intuitive experience, and certainly kind of clunky, right? And so you go online, you get a website, and primarily it was a way to just sort of like access content. And that was fine. That was really interesting. In a way, it sort of democratized access to a common set of information, a common network, at least for people who had access to an internet connection, which is a big if, obviously. Web 2 changed the web from a consumption medium to a collaborative medium. So basically, the web became a way not only to access information, but to upload your own content, to effectively become like a publisher of information. And so everyone had a platform to share their thoughts and their photos and their ideas, and around that built communities and tribes online. And that was a really powerful thing too. If Web 1 democratized access to information, Web 2 democratized access to publishing. Gave everyone a way to have a voice, at least again for those who had access to the internet. But Web 2 came with some steep costs. It concentrated power in the hands of a handful of companies that became monopolies in different parts of the economy. It basically kept people hooked on platforms with recommendation engines, which fed them disinformation and tried to sow division as a way to keep them engaged and clicking, which was problematic to say the least. It stifled innovation. The fact that we have natural monopolies now in all these different areas means trying to compete is quite difficult, and competition is the lifeblood of progress. So that was a problem as well. Those platforms also became chokeholds for governments that use them as a way to, surveil citizens, which is obviously problematic too. So taken as a whole, Web 2 had lots of advantages and benefits, to be sure, but it had some costs, some pretty steep ones at that.
Alex, if I may, like when you're saying it had, like you're talking about it like as if it's in the past. Like in my humble opinion, we are living in this right now. Like and it's like it's insane how it's impacting us like every day. So if you can maybe help us to understand a little, how do you see the transition that we finally get to the Web3?
Yeah, well, so you're right, and I should say. We had and have currently
I would be happy if that would be the case, but that's not, like, right, it's still happening, like a lot of mass disinformation, like which creates a lot of challenging situations. I'm not going to go like into what happening right now with the wars, like, and the opinions, and like people who are becoming angry because they actually don't get the full picture, and it's still happening as we speak.
Yeah. I have comments. I have thoughts about that too, but we'll park that for another conversation. But yeah, you're basically right that like this is the status quo for all intents and purposes. Like we're living it right now, and we're seeing the effects of that. Now, I don't think that Web3 is like a solution to every problem. Web3 is not going to make a war or conflict disappear. Maybe it'll make the reporting on it a little bit better, but in general, there are some things that are well beyond the reach of technology. But I do think that Web3 can help to input power in the hands of individuals at the expense of platforms, and that the way to do that is through ownership, because being an owner gives you power, gives you control, and gives you influence, and that's just not the way that these platforms operate today. So my view is that the transition, whatever the transition is not going to be abrupt. It's going to be gradual. In the sense that Web 2 companies, I believe, will continue to exist. They're not going away, and it's unlikely that they become user-owned networks or platforms. More likely that they'll, if anything, double down on their existing model and try and capture as much value as they can. And that's something that we've seen play out time and again with other transitions to new technologies. There's lots of Web 1 companies and even pre-internet companies that are still around and still make a lot of money. There's still HP and Dell and all America Online and Yahoo. Like these companies are still around. Like they're not, they haven't, they're maybe diminished versions of themselves. But the reason is that they missed the boat when it came to some big transformations. And they missed the transition from PCs to mobile, or they missed the transition from the internet of or of Web 1 to Web 2, from a broadcast medium to a social medium, and so on and so forth. And that's fine. And I think that they'll maybe continue to exist indefinitely. And I think the same will probably be true for Web 2 companies. But the question that I always ask is, in the last 20 years, $10 trillion, excuse me, of market cap, of value has been created in 7 companies. Where is the next $10 trillion going to get created? Is it just going to be that those companies become bigger and more powerful? And with inflation, it's probably more like $20 trillion, right? But where is that $10 trillion going to get created? Is it going to be that these big companies get more powerful, or is it going to be that the value accrues somewhere else because there are organizations or networks that are doing things differently and better? So the question is not like, when will Facebook become a Web3 company any more than it is like, when is Dell Computers going to become an internet company? Like, they're different categories. And so like, I don't see it happening. It's not going to happen. So the question is like, will people use Web3 ultimately? This isn't like some top-down directive that's like, now everyone move over to a user-owned network. It's like, let's see if user-owned networks find broad mass market appeal. We've seen that in limited degrees with DeFi and with NFTs and other sort of early social apps and other sort of examples of this. But can it scale? And that's a question that I think is an open one. And I'm happy to discuss what the challenges are to making that a reality, if you'd like.
Yeah, 100%. I think we should, because if we're going to be completely objective, so we're both participants of the market, so we cannot be 100% objective. We are evangelizing for the market, and we're like looking in the future for 5-10 years horizon, right? But if we talk about like what's happening right now, we had multiple events, like, so to speak, like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, like the FTXs of the world, and and also the the Luna Terra of the world, and that kills trust, right? As we know, in any industry, trust takes a lot of time to gain back, right? To win back from the users, and even, as you mentioned, NFTs, which is, in my opinion, still an amazing like invention, so to speak, an amazing tool of ownership. It can be used not only in art and like multiple other industries, but now the trust is gone because the monetary value went away, right? It's 98% down. So people looking at the prices, they're depressed. They're not looking at like 5 years horizon, right? So I think would be great, maybe if we can talk a little bit about what do you think is going to be the practical milestones, like, in the near future, which will help people to gain this trust and maybe take advantage of the technology in something that is not just like institutional level, right? But more like down to earth, like, the retail level.
You mentioned Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is an interesting analogy. I have a slightly different one, and it's not mine. It was given to me by someone else. So I had a conversation for the book with Albert Wenger, who's a very well-known venture capital investor, founder of Union Square Ventures. And they've been one of the earliest investors in crypto companies years before anybody even knew about it, right? 2012, 2013. And he said, once in a while, or he said, technologies come along, and every so often there's like a disaster of some kind. In the age of rail, like a lot of railroads derailed, killed a lot of people. And he says often, that doesn't really impact the growth of that technology, because the technology has, too much of a head of steam, no pun intended, that it sort of just moves on beyond that. But he said sometimes there's a disaster that does change the trajectory of a technology, and also changes how perceptions or changes perceptions about that technology. And he said, look at nuclear power. So similar to what you were saying, but he said, peace not as a weapon, but as a source of power. Nuclear power could wean us off of fossil fuels and probably help everyone to reach our clean energy objectives and maybe save the planet in the process. He says, but in the 1970s, we had this 3 Mile Island disaster, which kind of caused people to pause. And then we had Chernobyl. And Chernobyl completely altered the trajectory of nuclear power projects, right? New projects were put on hold. A lot of them got canceled. And the technology just simply never reached what I think a lot of people think is its potential, which is that it's an abundant, clean source of energy generation if run correctly, and assuming that there are no meltdowns. So I was having this conversation with Wenger in the fall of 2022, which we may recall was when FTX collapsed. We'd already had our 3 Mile Island with Voyager and Three Arrows and these other things. And I think everyone was a little on the ropes, and then bang, this thing happens, and it's like, holy shit. Is FTX the Chernobyl for this technology? Doesn't mean that it kills it, but it changes its trajectory. So maybe it was going to go like this, and then it just goes like this, and it flatlines, and it becomes a thing that tens of millions of people use and find useful and fun and engaging, but it never really reaches its potential. And I had to really reflect on that during the process of writing the book. And the conclusion that I reached was that it's not it's Chernobyl just simply because it's too early, and ultimately it didn't the radiation the half-life on the radiation is a lot shorter, right? This isn't going to be 30 years where we can't inhabit this area. It's going to be a year where we need to get through some difficult learn some hard lessons and move on from a troubled chapter in the history of tokens. Now, I will also add that there's more to the story, of course, than just crypto and exchanges. But just as there was more to nuclear power than one plant in Ukraine, but the reality is that one thing has kind of overwhelmed the story. So that's my sort of preamble. To answer your question directly, I mean, there are several challenges that need to be overcome. The technology needs to continue to scale to meet the demands. We need to build decentralized back end for Web3. Right now, Web3 applications on the front end are decentralized, but on the back end, they're often running on AWS or using data that's being provided by oracles, which are centralized. And all of those things make for an industry that's still kind of reliant on the old world. And then we need applications that people will want to use and that will find useful. DeFi was really interesting because there are tens of millions of people or whatever that love trading and speculating and investing and love the arcane minutia of finance, which frankly DeFi is extremely arcane. And I worked in traditional finance, and DeFi gives it a run for its money in terms of how convoluted and engineered it is. But it's also fundamentally very fascinating and very important. And I think that we need to apply that same passion to building, applications for people to trade and to invest and lend and borrow money and so on and so forth, and apply that to more broadly popular kinds of applications. So I do think that that's something that the industry needs to do a better job of. And then I also think that one of the things that we can do is engage more with business, with enterprises. I mean, certainly that's something that I've been doing for many years. We founded the Blockchain Research Institute 2017. I mean, that's a long time ago. And our founding membership included many of the largest companies, operating in the United States and Canada, and continues to do great work for lots of those organizations today. So I've got some hard-won experience in talking to business leaders. And I think that there is a belief in some corners of the industry that it's almost like selling out to go to big companies and see if they want to partner or collaborate or do something. But the reality is you have to be a pragmatist. I think that there are sort of three kinds of people in this industry. There's missionaries, mercenaries, and pragmatists. And you need missionaries to push the frontier because they're the ones who are willing to take all the risk and because they believe in the higher power, right? And then there are mercenaries, and take it or leave it. Like every frontier is going to have, its fair share. And then you've got pragmatists. And the pragmatists are the people that say, look, if we want to use our own web where people are empowered and have more privacy and more control, and where anyone anywhere can access these tools and use them as a way to move and store value and earn money in a globally distributed and level playing field, and if that's the objective here, then let's figure out how to do it. Let's scale this thing so that we can reach the next billion people. And that's the kind of, I don't know, if I'm in any camp, I'm in that camp.
So it's really interesting that you mentioned the reason why I did, by the way, I didn't mention Chernobyl because for me it was very personal. I'm from Ukraine originally, so it was 2 years after I was born, right? So like all those stories emerged, and I was very involved. Like when my family like moved out for a certain period of time, so
Yeah.
that was the case. Now, if we compare it to what happened to the recent events, as you mentioned, even Voyager, the 3 hours, then Lunaterra, then FTX, and many other companies who went under. Now, obviously, it's not a complete disaster, right? People lost money. It's uncomfortable. However, we know that cycle already happened and probably will happen again, unfortunately. The question a lot of
I
people
hope.
are asking, well, maybe in a different way, right? The question what we have to ask is, so how do we learn from it? What conclusion you have to drive to make sure that, like one of the things that I've discovered recently with another person who we had an interview, like Lee Bretcher, who's basically a co-founder of the Texas Blockchain Council, right? They now passed a bill of proof of reserves, right, which would not completely prevent the disaster of FTX, but at least we would see what are the gap between the reserves that the company holds, and actual, assets that they either lend or, some of the other, accountability, and tools. Now, my question to you, wearing the pragmatic hat that you mentioned, right? So what are the top three exciting things that you see and applications, user-centric applications that you think they will drive the new wave of adoption?
Yeah. So, well, just to roll it back, because I want to respond to what you said. So, like, what are the things we can do differently to try and learn from it? I think you're probably right that things like this will happen again for the simple reason that human beings are fallible, and there are they say exponential times lead to exponential crimes. I mean, technology tools empower criminals. Technology tools are not neutral. You can use a computer to hack into a bank account or something like that. You can use a train. You can stop a train and stick up 150 people. So there's that part of it too. And I also think one of the things that I kind of wrestle with a little bit is that the web, the first era of the web, democratized access to information, but it also democratized access to disinformation. And I think that as a society, with no way for everyone to validate the truthfulness of things, we end up in this position where we're constantly trying to sift out what's real from what's not, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's either spin or what is just outright falsehoods. And I think that today, in the United States and other countries, many people are falling victim to both of those things, where they're being manipulated or they're being told just things that are factually incorrect. And so I sometimes think about that, like in the context of Web3. It's like Web3 democratizes access to ownership, but it also democratizes access to sort of financial scams in a way, and it's like, is that the equivalent of disinformation? If anybody can publish information on the internet, then you're going to end up with a lot of bullshit. And if anybody can spin up an asset and sell it to somebody, then you're going to end up with a lot of scams. You're going to end up with a lot of great new organizations and businesses and innovation and entrepreneurship, but you're also going to have this externality. So how do you control for this externality? Well, in information, we haven't figured it out. Like, there is no solution to the disinformation problem that exists in our world. And the question is, is there going to be a solution to that? I think probably the closest thing we can get to is regulation. I mean, it's still illegal it's not illegal to say something untrue, I don't think. And I'm sure under some circumstances it is, but in general, people have like protected speech, right? If you say like the sky is green when it's blue, you're not going to get arrested. But if you, at least not in Canada and the US so far, but if if you spin up some asset and say it's one thing and it isn't, then you're obviously going to be committing fraud. And so you need to be held accountable. So anybody who says this technology can't scale without rules, without regulation, I think is wrong. So in terms of innovations, there's a couple things that I'm really interested in. I think that account abstraction is a very important innovation. I think that we need ways for people to access to on ramp into this industry and not feel as terrified of losing their coins because they've misplaced a private key or been victim of some hacking attack or something. We need like a better form of sort of social consensus and a better interface for people to access it. By the way, I think that the market for self custody and token ownership could be in the billions of people, but right now, based on how it's currently like how it works, it's not. It's like the number of people that were willing to go to Radio Shack and buy a modem and clog up their home phone line in order to operate like a PC and access the early web. That was a small segment of the population.
Of
But
course.
once people had access to broadband and Wi-Fi, and that was integrated into the hardware, and the browser was a lot nicer to use than Mosaic, and all of a sudden, oh, well, this is something everybody wants to use. So that on-ramp, that interface is extremely important. So that's number one. Number two, I think that DeFi remains the thing that one of the things I'm most excited about. And I think that our problem is that in DeFi, I say our, I mean, I'm not in the DeFi world, though I do host a podcast called DeFi Decoded. But basically, like, you can't just replace counterparty risk with contract risk. You can't just, it's not an improvement if there's still risk, it just exists in another way. So if you want to make the system more efficient, you need to address the issue. And the issue is that people are spinning up projects without doing due diligence on their own code. So I think that's like something that's very important. And then in terms of application specific stuff, the two things I'm most interested in are gaming and decentralized physical infrastructure. So on the gaming front, the argument is really simple. People already spend billions of dollars on virtual goods, but they don't own them. They're renting them at best. So my thesis is simply put that, like, if you're going to spend billions of dollars on something, you might as well own it. You might as well have the ability to sell it, to participate in price appreciation if it goes up, to be able to control it if you want, to take it with you outside of an environment. And I think that the next sort of frontier for gaming is going to be based on that concept. And it's not a revolution, it's an evolution, because owning in-game assets has been part of gameplay for decades. And so I think that that's a very natural transition. And then on the DePIN side, decentralized physical infrastructure, I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier about challenges. If you want to scale a decentralized web, then you need decentralized stack. And that includes everything from, rendering to storage to mapping data to maybe even, internet connectivity and so on and so forth. But either way, I'm really excited about DePIN because I think it addresses that issue and can help fulfill the vision, but B, it could just do things better. Like, in the end, this isn't all like an ideological exercise. The whole concept is like, can these tools enable us to do things better? And better has lots of meanings, but one meaning is more accurate, more timely data and information and capability. So there's a project that I talk about in the book called Hive Mapper, which is basically using kind of a combination, what I would call like a synergy of IoT, AI, and blockchain to address this issue. So basically, you buy a camera, a dash cam, you put it on your dash, and as you're driving around, doing whatever it is you're doing, you're going to the store, or maybe you're an Uber driver or something, it's collecting all of this data, mapping data, image data, and so forth. That wouldn't have been possible without, relatively cheap, high quality cameras and other equipment, right? So that's the things part. And it wouldn't have been possible without AI because it needs to, be able to identify objects, and it needs to be able to tell the difference between a stop sign and a turn signal or whatever. And so there's all that part of it. And then there's the Web3 or the crypto part of it is, how do you create incentives for people to do this in the first place? Like, why would I do this? What's the point? I mean, maybe I do it for fun. There are lots of people who volunteer their time and money even to help out. But rather than altruism, can we get some, basic incentive for people to do it. So Hive Mappers mapped 5 million kilometers, about 8% of the world's surface so far. And it's only been around for like a year. And so like to me, that's kind of an interesting story. And the idea is that, you know, in a lot of places where most people are operating their Hive Mapper dash cams, this is places like New York and like Seoul, Korea, and LA, I think they said. They're getting more accurate and more timely data than any Google car ever could, because it doesn't matter how many Google cars you put on the road. You can have dozens or hundreds of Hive Mapper cars in a city, and you don't need everybody driving one. You need like a few dozen, and then all of a sudden you're going to like cover the whole town basically. So I
Mhm.
find that just very, very interesting as well. And I think that the next sort of phase is going to see some really interesting growth in those two areas. And then I think, you know, everyone talks about RWAs, real world assets. You know, I've been talking about security tokens since 2016, because that was kind of how I first got into this, right? It was like, wow, I wonder if we could apply this to existing assets. That was the genesis of my whole interest in this, 2015, 14. And yeah, there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come again. So hopefully this time around it has some success. But we know that RWAs work because we have stable coins, and that's a $120 billion market. And that's something where we clearly have the technology ability to do it. We have the product market fit. Everybody wants dollars. And from a regulatory perspective, you know, it's kind of global. It's operating at this sort of level that makes it so that it's sort of hard to shut down, I guess, you know, for better or for worse. Anyway, so the point is that is kind of where we're at with stablecoins. The question is for everyone else that wants to tokenize a piece of art or tokenize real estate or tokenize, you know, shares in a company or bonds or money market funds or mutual funds or whatever. If you want to do all that stuff, like turning it into a token doesn't make it a better investment.
Mhm.
Underlying thing needs to be what people want to own. And if the tokenization process makes it easier for more kinds of people to own it and gives it additional functionality, then great. If it doesn't, and you're just like reselling a token to your existing market that's used to buying, you know, in a traditional way, you're just like duplicating effort. You're achieving nothing. You're not solving any problem, right? And I just look at a lot of these projects. I'm like, all I see is a duplication of effort. And I don't blame the founders, because typically it's because, you know, the regulatory and the business environment requires some very circumscribed, narrow application of the technology. And if that's what you have to do, then you're better off focusing your efforts somewhere else.
Yes. I mean, it's a fascinating topic. Like, and I'm afraid to even ask you more questions because I do have like while you were speaking, I collected like at least three or four. But I actually wanna keep it like, you know, something like an intrigue for people to buy your book, like get acquainted with your vision, with your views, and actually go then and meet you in the cities where you present the book. I am actually honored that I'm gonna, you know, meet you in person today in New York and your book presentation. And I actually urge people to just follow your schedule, right? And I know you're gonna have like different schedules in different cities, not only in North America, but also in other countries. So please do that. Like, and we're gonna share all the links, you know, like where people can find you. I mean, where are you more active, on Twitter or like LinkedIn?
Yeah, Twitter's, I think, where people should go, at Alex Tapscott.
Okay.
Check that, please. Yeah. And also web3booktour.com. If you want to join us, we've got a few more tour dates planned between now and the end of November. But most importantly, yeah, check out my book. The best way to buy it is in massive volume.
Yes, bulk, buy bulk, and then distribute to your institution. So here it is. Like I already bought it, so please, I urge you to also do the same. Before we end this interview, which is very interesting, like you know, to see to pick your brain and you know talk to the author, you know himself. I always prepare this one question, which is deeply personal, and I never notify my guests because I think this is the most beautiful part of it. Like you know that you're gonna be genuine in the answer, right? So you're writing this book, you're you know doing the business, you have I know you have an amazing family, you have kids, and you're doing it for a reason. There's a purpose behind it. So I want to know, what is your purpose in life, Alex?
My purpose in life.
Yes. Or what is the meaning of life, if you want a better version of the question for you?
I, I'll tell you what works for me. What works for me is that I try to live a principled life of some consequence. You know, I try to apply my values to what I do, and I try to make a difference. And it, I think that's something everyone can do. Um, and it doesn't need to be, starting some company or becoming president or something like or whatever. There are lots of ways to have an impact. I think probably the way that I've had the most positive impact is actually as an educator, as someone who's able to uh, decode complex ideas and um, make them understandable or make them digestible. And I'm doing that because, like, what's the reason why I'm doing it with Web3 and not, some other topic? Well, I think that this is a really important technology, and I think it's going to potentially change the world if we will it. I think I said at the outset, the future is not something to be predicted; it's something to be achieved. And so I think in my small part, in my way, I'm helping to do that. But there are dozens of other, well, many more than dozens, but pioneers, builders, other educators, people who are helping to, push us forward as a species. And if I'm playing some small role in that, then I'm doing my part.
It's a beautiful answer. Well, I'm wishing you to fulfill more and more like of your purpose in life and like to disseminate this revolution, help others to educate themselves and be this conduit of knowledge and positivity, right? Thank you so much for the interview and really excited to see you today.
Thanks.